Welcome and good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, from wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. My name is Keval Paradia, and I'm part of South Asia Solidarity Group. Our meeting today is titled Authoritarian Sri Lanka, Caught Between India, China, and Massive Debt. Should we look beyond the UN? The UN released its report on Sri Lanka in January and said, the failure of Sri Lanka to address past violations has significantly heightened the risk of human rights violations being repeated. The report highlights worrying trends over the past year, such as deepening impunity, increasing militarization of governmental functions, ethno-nationalism and rhetoric, and intimidation of civil society. Nearly 12 years after the armed conflict in Sri Lanka ended, impunity for grave human rights violations and abuses by all sides is more entrenched than ever, with the current government proactively obstructing investigations and trials and reversing the limited progress that had been previously made, states the report. This very critical report has been welcomed by the global human rights advocacy community and by sections of the progressive opinion, both in Sri Lanka and abroad, as an important step to prevent Sri Lanka from sliding down the path of constructing a full-on militarized authoritarian government that further strengthens the Sinhala Buddhist majoritarian rule, marginalizing minorities even further and targeting the left and democratic spaces in the country. This could get worse since Sri Lanka is in the throes of a very significant economic crisis because of the neoliberal path it chose to tread many years ago. So Sri Lanka is once again in the docks at the UN Human Rights Council, responding to criticisms and investigations about its conduct during the civil war that ended nearly 12 years ago. Sri Lanka, instead of building peace and reconciliation between the state and its minorities, went down the triumphalist path to reinforce Sinhala Buddhist majoritarian state even further. So we ask today, how can the current government that seeks to converge all power in the executive have the welfare of its people at heart? We also ask here today, how effective are these international mechanisms, and do they fairly deal with the Sri Lankan government? We have two speakers here today, Nirmala and Alan, to try and make sense of all of this, and hopefully offer us a path towards justice and peace. They will each speak for about 20 minutes, followed by Q&As. First, I ask Alan Keenan, who is Crisis Group's senior consultant on Sri Lanka, to speak. Based in London, he coordinates and contributes to the organization's research, publications, and advocacy on Sri Lanka. Alan has lived and worked in Sri Lanka for extended periods since his first visit in February 2000. He has a PhD in political theory and has taught at various US colleges and universities before joining Crisis Group in 2006. So thank you, Alan, for joining us. And if I can ask you to go first.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I much prefer talking to this sort of audience than to my more normal audience of diplomats and sort of international people and media. So it's fun, especially given the kind of left progressive focus of the South Asia Solidarity Group. So I will go over some of what was in a recent commentary that I wrote and that the International Crisis Group published earlier this week. So I'll use that as kind of my guiding frame, but try to deepen some of the thoughts, if possible, that are in that document. And you can get that document online at the Crisis Group website if you want. So let me just begin so I will focus on what's happening right now at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, which is having its annual late winter, spring sessions. And at this session, Sri Lanka is once again on the agenda, as it has been periodically since 2012. If the Human Rights Council doesn't choose to continue to keep Sri Lanka on its agenda with a new resolution, then Sri Lanka will be, or the risk will be that Sri Lanka falls off the international political discourse entirely. It's never been quite up there with Syria or Yemen or the Congo or a few other really very dire places, but it has occasionally gotten on the agenda of the great powers and international institutions. And I think that is I'll be arguing, one of the functions of the Human Rights Council is to keep the issue of Sri Lanka and what to do about both the past violations and worrying trends of growing authoritarianism and breakdown of the rule of law and so forth, how to keep those on the agenda. But let me begin by saying sort of a general point, which is I think what we see at the Human Rights Council, but actually throughout, both within Sri Lanka and but particularly in terms of international engagement and pressure on Sri Lanka, is that every avenue you use or go down, or every tool you use, is ambiguous. It carries risks, dangers, is inadequate. There's no easy or clear answers or paths to encourage democratic reform, reconciliation, justice of various sorts in Sri Lanka. Everything you try brings with it risks. And I think that is definitely true of the Human Rights Council. And I would say, sort of a corollary of that is that what you do, whatever happens to the Human Rights Council, it's insufficient. I think it's necessary. The Human Rights Council has become, basically for lack of other options, the central site for international discussion and potential pressure and encouragement of reform on Sri Lanka or in Sri Lanka. But it's inadequate also. It's deeply inadequate. Principally because, unlike the UN Security Council, the UN Human Rights Council has no enforcement powers. So it's really sort of, it can make statements, it can pass resolutions, it can state what a country should do. But if the country doesn't do it, the council itself can't do anything about it. It can pass another resolution. And this is what we've seen periodically since 2012. We've seen a series of initially tougher resolutions, and then briefly with the resolutions known as 30/1 in October 2015, you had a resolution that was endorsed, in fact, co-sponsored by the Sri Lankan government itself. And there was a brief window where people thought, with the UN's encouragement and the encouragement of the powerful governments that were supporting this resolution, principally the United States, that there might actually be some positive and lasting change in Sri Lanka. Fortunately, what we saw was some positive change that didn't really go very deep and that didn't last. And so we're back not just to square one before 2015, but in some ways to even a more difficult political situation, particularly for minority communities, Tamils and Muslims, and in some sense Christians as well, but also more generally to progressive left liberal forces within Sri Lanka. But while the Human Rights Council is insufficient, it nonetheless, I think, helps define international understanding of Sri Lanka and helps set the international agenda towards Sri Lanka. And this can affect a wide range of international policies and affect domestic politics as well, which is why I think it can't simply be dismissed, even though it does lack any clear kind of way of forcing change in Sri Lanka. But I think it's not without its risks as well. So it's both insufficient and risky in the sense that outside, pronouncements from the UN Human Rights Council or from those powerful countries like the US or Britain or the EU or Australia or occasionally India can easily be parried by the Sri Lankan government, and they have been in the past many times, can be used to sort of rally their nationalist forces. To say the Western countries, the former colonialists, the current neo-colonialists have it out for us. They're trying to deny us the fruits of the great victory over terrorism. They don't want us to be a strong government. They want us to be sort of under their control for various reasons. And the fact that the global powers that are behind the various resolutions in the past, the fact that they do in fact have economic and political interests and are far from innocent, do-good institutions, but have their own political agendas. And in the case of of the UK, which is leading the process on the Human Rights Council right now for Sri Lanka, is a not that long ago colonial power. All of that makes it easier for the government, I think, to dismiss action as sort of illegitimate and contradictory or full of double standards, etc. But I think, despite that, I think in some sense the lack of action by the Human Rights Council would send an even more worrisome message than whatever it does do and whatever risks action might take, whatever form that might take. So as announced, sort of laid out in the High Commissioner's report, the report of the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights that we just heard a very brief précis of, what that laid out was sort of a two-track policy, sort of a more backward-looking one that looks at the continued need for accountability for past serious violations of human rights, of international humanitarian law during the war, of international human rights law during and after the war, and the need to make some, to bring justice for the many thousands of victims, principally Tamil victims, but also including Sinhalese and Muslims and dissenting populations. But also the need for any kind of Human Rights Council resolution and follow-up action to take a preventive mode, to try to name and address and bring relief to or prevent from getting worse the current very dangerous deterioration in the rule of law and in democratic space and constitutional provisions for whether for minorities or for the rule of law or for independence of institutions independent of the executive presidency and so forth. And the High Commissioner's report lays out those growing risks or that deterioration and the risks of further human rights violations or possibly even violent social conflict, communal conflict that might flow from them. So I think the report of the High Commissioner is excellent, and it's been backed up by long reports from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, supported by many interventions by local and some reporting by local human rights groups and civil society groups. But so I think that the situation is hard to debate from relatively objective perspectives. There's no question that Sri Lanka is growing more authoritarian. The space for dissent, space for minority rights, the space for real democratic politics is shrinking and could continue to shrink in dangerous ways. But in terms of these two tracks of action, sort of backward-looking accountability and forward-looking prevention, let me take first the first. On accountability, the High Commissioner's report was welcomed by many, I think, for taking a very tough line and for making the following points. One, saying that accountability, particularly for what happened at the very end of the war in Sri Lanka, where upwards of tens of thousands, exact numbers are uncertain, civilians were killed in illegal ways, which was the responsibility principally, but not solely, of the Sri Lankan government. The Tamil Tigers also contributed to that great loss of life too, I think, in important ways. But there's still been no legal accountability, no real reckoning, certainly no apology, no even acknowledgement by the Sri Lankan state of that terrible loss. In fact, just complete denial. And I think the High Commissioner's report is exemplary for saying this is not acceptable and accountability is still very much needed, and to make clear that it's not going to happen in Sri Lanka, that despite occasional nods in the direction of it by previous governments and occasional sort of a very insufficient attempt by the current government to say they will set up a new commission of inquiry to look into the reports of the old commissions of inquiry that have led to nothing. The High Commissioner has made clear that that's inadequate and that accountability is needed, and the only place for that to happen is at the international level. And her report gave a number of very specific suggestions on how to do that. So the one which got the most attention was her recommendation to member states of the Council to consider referral of Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court for investigation and possible prosecution. The problem with that is it's extremely hard to, because the UN security, because Sri Lanka is not a signatory to the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court, the only way issues or events that have happened there, possible crimes, can get to the court is with the approval of the UN Security Council, on which sit two very strong supporters of Sri Lanka, Russia and China. So that's not going to happen. There are very complicated possible ways of cases getting to the ICC more indirectly, but they're very hard to pull off and very unlikely to happen. Nonetheless, I think as a sign of the gravity and significance and need for action on the events of the end of the war, the High Commissioner's suggestion that the ICC route should be considered is welcome and was very welcomed by a lot of activist groups, and particularly groups of survivors and representatives of families of victims and survivors in Sri Lanka. The High Commissioner also recommended targeted sanctions against alleged perpetrators in the Sri Lankan government, military leaders, political leaders who were involved in the decisions that led to the deaths of so many civilians. Also recommended that member states pursue their potential legal cases in their own jurisdictions under the principle of universal jurisdiction. And finally, the High Commissioner's report called on the Council to give her office what she called, I think, dedicated capacity to establish a mechanism for the gathering of evidence of these crimes, which could then be used to pursue legal cases elsewhere, whether at the international level or in domestic jurisdictions of individual member states. All of that was highly welcomed. However, there was a lot of disappointment when the so-called core group of member states on the Human Rights Council made public their initial draft of a resolution, because while it endorsed the general call for accountability and for the international community to support accountability in Sri Lanka, it also watered down, either left out or watered down some of the key elements in the High Commissioner's report, i.e. it didn't mention the International Criminal Court. The mechanism for gathering evidence was made much weaker, and it didn't mention targeted sanctions. It did implicitly suggest the need for universal jurisdiction by member states, although it did it in a way that was that many, I think, didn't really notice. So this has led to great disappointment, understandably, I think. But I think it's important also to recognize the reasons why the members of the core group, which is led by Britain, which also has Canada, Germany, and then 3 smaller countries, Malawi, North Macedonia, and Montenegro on it, that the Human Rights Council is a political body. The only way resolutions get passed is by getting a majority, or at least a plurality of the 47 members. Each of those member states has its own set of political interests and approaches and degrees of democracy, degrees of commitment to human rights. And it's not easy to get a majority for a very tough resolution, particularly what are called country-specific resolutions, those that actually name a specific country as opposed to a thematic issue or a more general issue, are often highly contested and resisted by a large number of the key states, not least China and lots of other powerful, not very human rights friendly regimes. So it's always a political question to try to figure out how strong a resolution you can get a majority for. So I think the calculation was by some of these members drafting the resolution that to have a resolution that was very strong on accountability, that mentions the ICC, that mentions that, for instance, that called for an independent mechanism for the gathering and coordination of evidence, would be too hard to sell to win the votes. So that's a complicated political calculation. The resolution can be strengthened over the coming weeks before it comes to a vote at the probably on the 22nd or 23rd of March. But we'll have to wait and see whether that happens. But crucially, what I argue in this small commentary on the Crisis Group's website is that it's important not to let the accountability issue overwhelm the urgent nature of the deterioration in democracy and human rights in Sri Lanka, and the need for some forms of pressure and sort of some forms of international engagement which could contain the worst tendencies of the Sri Lankan government. And that preventative approach, I think, was also laid out in the High Commissioner's report and needs to be taken seriously, because I think there's a danger that the accountability issue will obscure, or will sort of will lead various countries in the international community and international media to think of Sri Lanka as an old conflict, right? As merely raising issues about what happened in the past, and obscuring the fact that the same guys who are responsible for what happened in the past are back in power, and in some sense in a more virulently nationalist and more aggressive form than they were before, and that there are real risks of further closure of democratic space, further deterioration or assault on the rule of law and human rights, and crucially growing risks of intercommunal violence. So those issues, I think, need to be put front and center in any Human Rights Council resolution. In the current draft, of the British core group draft, there's mention of these emerging trends and sort of the risks they bring, but I think it could be strengthened. I think in particular, the High Commissioner could be encouraged to use some of her preventative capacities, her preventive powers, which would include calling special intercessional, what are called intercessional briefings, basically briefing the Human Rights Council as the situation gets worse, if it does in Sri Lanka. But I think there is, let me just close, since I realize I only have a couple more minutes, but let me close by saying I think one of the functions, whatever's in the resolution, doesn't do itself anything. It just states the problem, it maybe makes some recommendations to member states. But I think what it can do is it can help frame an agenda for other institutions, for other member states, for other institutions to take action. And I think this might feed into what Nirmal is going to talk about, because I think, as anyone who follows Sri Lanka knows, Sri Lanka is already facing an enormous debt crisis, which could lead to a very active economic crisis when Sri Lanka runs out of money, basically, and is unable to pay its bondholders. Now, it's possible they have certainly been turning to China and hoping that China will bail them out, but it remains a question whether China is willing to fully bail out Sri Lanka. Many think that they'll have to go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for the additional hard currency that will tide them over, and that the IMF, as is its tendency, will insist on significant structural reforms, which will lead to greater economic suffering and pain for average Sri Lankans, which will then potentially further the political crisis and put possibly further pressure on minority communities, in particular Muslims, who can be used as scapegoats. So I think there is a really interesting calculation, I think, that has to be made, and maybe I'll just close on this point, because I think this might lead into Nirmala's presentation. But on the one hand, there is a temptation, and it makes sense, for outside powers and outside concerned people like me and my institutions I work for and similar ones, to try to look for points of leverage on the Sri Lankan government, to say, if you continue down your current path of attacking minorities and weakening rights and concentrating power in the military and the executive, there'll be there's going to be a cost to you, and that one of the forms of raising those costs is through economic pressure. But of course, economic pressure, whether in the form of, I don't think people are talking about sanctions for Sri Lanka, but any form of international economic pressure could lead to greater suffering for average Sri Lankans, and could in fact heighten political and social tensions, and therefore sort of exacerbate or feed the very kinds of tensions and negative political dynamics and authoritarian tendencies that we're trying to ratchet back, not ratchet up. So I think there's some real interesting ethical, political dilemmas there about what forms of pressure from outside might work, what their risks are, how to maybe mitigate some of their risks, and how crucially to support and take the lead from activists and sort of popular movements to the extent that they still exist in Sri Lanka, to take the lead from them and not make their life more difficult in the name of supporting them. And I have a few suggestions of other sort of specific actions that could be, specific forms of leverage that we could discuss perhaps in the Q&A if people are interested. Okay, I'll leave it there and I'll look forward to what Nirmala has to say.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was fascinating, and laying out some of the complexities that we have to deal with locally on the ground there in Sri Lanka, but also what the international community can do, and some of the limitations, perhaps, as you're pointing out, of the international community. And we very much look forward to hearing you in the Q&A talk about some of those points of leverage, what sounded like from a grassroots perspective, and how people on the ground there can actually come together. Thank you very much for that.
Welcome.
So next, we have Nirmala Rajasingham, who is a lifelong left feminist political activist, an Amnesty prisoner of conscience, having spent nearly 2 years in solitary confinement in prison. She came to the UK as a refugee, fleeing the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE nearly 30 years ago, and has been an active member of South Asia Solidarity Group since then. So I'll hand over to Nirmala. Thank you.
Thank you, Keval, and thank you, Alan, for that very detailed and clear explanation of the procedure at the Human Rights Council and touching on all the options that we have in Sri Lanka to take this issue forward. Accepting most of what Alan has said, I want to sort of go laterally a bit and look at the whole situation from a different vantage point. Since the end of the war in 2009, the international gaze has been upon Sri Lanka in a bid to seek accountability and justice for those who died in the final phase of the civil war. The Tamil people of Sri Lanka also have been looking to the international community to achieve closure on this tragic chapter of their history. During the final phase of the war, the UN system completely failed the Tamils, trapped between two murderous armies. This is publicly documented. Despite the highly welcome and hard-hitting report and recommendations of the current High Commissioner of the Human Rights Council, Sri Lanka is likely to come out of this process relatively unscathed because of geopolitical considerations and ultimately the unenforceability of these UN human rights mechanisms, especially when a country has powerful supporters in the background. And I just want you to note Joe Biden's statement on wanting to rejoin the Human Rights Council and his misgivings about how Israel is being dealt with in the HRC. The Sri Lankan government denies all responsibility for war crimes, the numbers of dead and forcibly disappeared, and blames the LTT solely for its own war crimes. I mean, basically, they are reversing all knowledge and acknowledgements and opinion built around the end of the war about the history of discrimination and suffering of the Tamil people in Sri Lanka. And they are simply reversing all of that and saying, oh, it's all the fault of the LTT. Everything begins with the LTT as far as the government is concerned. Domestically, the Rajapaksas have been able to come to power with a resounding majority, capitalizing on the war victory 10 years later, and also stoking fear in the hearts of the Sinhala majority precisely about such internal investigations that the Sinhala Buddhist nation is under threat from external forces. The current government has started to deepen its authoritarian rule with sweeping constitutional changes. It has amassed power wholesale with systematic militarization and politicization of the state's agencies, especially the judiciary. The government has set up quasi-judicial, unaccountable commissions of inquiry that seek to wipe the state clean about past wrongdoing against minorities. Many facing prosecution for war crimes or other human rights violations have been pardoned, acquitted, or had their convictions quashed, while Tamil and Muslim youth languish in prison for months, years, and even decades. This consolidated power is wielded by one strong man, the president, who rules by fiat. The rationale behind all of this is that such measures are implemented to protect the interests of the Sinhala Buddhists. the legitimate inhabitants of this island. On the other hand, Tamil people have been led to believe that deliverance and justice will come from international interventions, and expectations in the past have been raised to fever pitch, especially in the diaspora. After the total defeat of the LTT, Tamil nationalism has no answer still and looks to the international community, indeed to the West, for deliverance. The Tamil nationalist parties now mainly invest their political energies in the international human rights process. There's also a political expediency to employing this kind of rhetoric, as it is good election sloganeering. Even though the Sri Lankan state has scapegoated Tamils for a long time, Sinhala Buddhist nationalism has fashioned new enemies. With attacks on the Tamil community simmering along on the side, the state has begun to refocus its ethno nationalist hatred towards the Muslim community by instigating pogroms, forcibly cremating those suspected to have died of COVID, and persecution against individual Muslims. Since the Easter Sunday attacks, the detention centers, once filled with Tamil PTA suspects, are now filled with Muslim PTA suspects. Laws meant to protect minorities, such as anti hate laws, are being used against them in many perverse ways, and the war on terror rhetoric targeting Muslims is in full popular usage in Sri Lanka. Such an alarming rise in repression against minorities at times also turns against Sinhala dissenters, human rights defenders, Sinhala human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, and trade unionists who challenge the government and the majoritarian values of the state. The big question, however, is how the economic crisis facing Sri Lanka and the survival games of the government in the economic sphere will impact on its diplomatic standing globally. Sri Lanka is teetering on the edge of defaulting on its debt repayments, and the only solution is to borrow more from institutions like the IMF, uh, which will bring more hardship. The country may avert this crisis temporarily, as there has been frenetic activity recently around more borrowing, more deals with China and India to do currency swaps, loans, and economic development deals that would not necessarily benefit Sri Lanka in the long term. So, even before the pandemic, the Sri Lankan economy was in crisis. Soaring unemployment, falling living standards, pauperization of the low income communities were already evident. Now, with COVID, we may see hitherto unknown levels of poverty at the lower income levels, especially because the once robust welfare safety net has been significantly eroded to neoliberal reforms and through structural adjustment policies imposed by institutions like the IMF. The contestation between China and India over economic and political sovereignty over Sri Lanka is an important consideration. Sri Lanka is under tremendous pressure from both over its allegiances. Indian tycoon Adani was offered the East Terminal at the Colombo port, negotiated by India, obviously, with the rest of the port in Chinese hands. With protests from port workers and Chinese unhappiness, it was withdrawn, but it now appears the offer is back on the table. There's always this confusion about who Sri Lanka is going to go with. It is unclear whether the bid to jointly develop the Trincomalee oil tank farm facilities are going to be scrapped, and we get contradictory statements from both India and Sri Lanka. In the north of Jaffna, barely 22 miles from India, China is negotiating to park their alternative energy production project in the small islands off Jaffna. This is just 22 miles off the coast of India. I mean, this is such a dangerous development. The Western powers' unhappiness with Sri Lanka is more, I think, about the fact that it has drifted into the Chinese economic orbit. While discussions go on in the Human Rights Council, the powerful core group countries that have sponsored the resolution do not want to drive Sri Lanka further into the arms of China wholesale, as they themselves are competing with China on trade and influence in South Asia, and also because India is an important ally. Also, it must be said that the debt burden Sri Lanka carries is not of China's making alone. Most of its debt is to global financial institutions and uh, private financial institutions. The other factor to take into consideration is how should Sri Lanka deal with Big Brother India. The BJP's parent organization, the RSS, and accompanying other little organizations, with their dreams about an Akhand Bharat, the greater India, the greater Bharat, where Sri Lanka will be a mere province, is thrusting its political tentacles, making links with extremist Sinhala Buddhist organizations and offering support to fledgling Tamil Hindu nationalist organizations, citing a quote unquote civilizational link. Tamil nationalism has never been overtly Hindu nationalist, but such tendencies are rearing their ugly head among Sri Lankan Tamils only since the BJP came to power. The support to these two extremist religious views in Sri Lanka can spill over and could lead to the further marginalization of the Muslim minority community. These hegemonic designs by a power so close to us geographically seriously complicates the domestic political scene in Sri Lanka. The murky affair about who actually commandeered the Easter Sunday attack is a question in point. I now want to look at reconciliation, because eventually the purpose of all these mechanisms, and for instance the LLRC, and the consultation task force's findings, the various mechanisms, is to bring about eventually some form of reconciliation. We recognize that these three communities, Sinhala, Tamil, and Muslims, have to live on that island together. Reconciliation is a political process. It is about a reckoning between political communities that are hopelessly polarized. This political process can become meaningful when the very process itself begins to create the dynamic and circumstances that could impel further dialogue and exploration, we hope. And I also am concerned, how can it be imposed from above through a set of prescriptive legal measures? Can the answers to how it should be done be predetermined at the outset? The expectation, I'm asking these questions because of my belief in the sort of limitations, the very limited nature of international mechanisms. If ultimately these processes have to take place within the country, but unfortunately the current government will not allow these processes to take place. The expectation that the current authoritarian government, or even the previous governments, all of them formed by singular Buddhist nationalist majoritarian parties or consensus, could set in motion a process of accountability and reconciliation is perplexing, as both have scuppered plans for devolution of power to the minorities alternately and have entrenched systemic discrimination and sown discord among ethnicities for more than 7 decades. This current government, of course, presents a very heightened problem of the same thing, heightened version of the same problem. Now, singular Buddhist nationalism has reached peak form, become far more belligerent, warlike, and vicious than it has ever been, even after the total defeat of the LTTE. Its muscularity is also due to the huge militarization of the singular Buddhist majoritarian state. The future appears worryingly insecure, and for minorities and those Sinhalese who dissent from the hegemonic singular Buddhist state. However, how do we explain to the Tamils and Muslims that resistance to such an overweeningly nationalist state that is on a full-on journey towards total authoritarianism maybe should not rely on a similarly exclusionary ideology that is a solely nationalist imagining is inadequate to understand the minorities' political problems and is certain to lead us to a cul-de-sac. Tamil nationalism is also majoritarian vis-a-vis the Muslim community, as evidenced by the many massacres of Muslims by the LTT during the war. And now we need a separate reconciliation process to happen between Tamils and Muslims. The P2P march that brought together thousands of Tamils and Muslims recently got us all very excited, but was organized and carried out on terms largely set by Tamil nationalist forces, we understand. Building an alliance of two minority communities on an equal and inclusive basis does not sit well with purely nationalist objectives. Tamil nationalism itself has its many fault lines, such as caste, gender, and regional cleavages, which are only made worse by exclusionary nationalism. Nationalism also capitulates abysmally, as in the case of the northern Tamil fishermen. This is simply an illustration where none of the Tamil nationalist parties wish to take up the matter with India, where the livelihoods of these fishermen are being destroyed daily by big trawler fishing boats from Tamil Nadu. The Tamil nationalist parties fully rely on India to exert pressure on Sri Lanka for the devolution issue as well. This is becoming more and more significant because the current government may be planning to scupper, to get rid of the 13th Amendment, which promises devolution to the provincials, to the provinces, and thereby the minority regions. A small measure of power sharing, which is on the books, and if it gets in its new constitution that it proposes to make, it may get rid of the 13th Amendment. And the only so this is a very worrying sign. So and the Tamil nationalist parties have only India as the main guarantor, because India has already said you cannot get rid of the 13th Amendment. Similarly, there are tense discussions within the Muslim community about the relationship between themselves and the governments of Muslim countries globally in seeking their support to put pressure on the Sri Lankan government. Another issue is that the international, what I want to say is Tamils and Muslims also have to think about how they can work together with the Sinhalese within the country. We can talk about that later. Another issue is that the international accountability mechanism focuses mainly on the war crimes and crimes against humanity during the last phase of the war between the government and the LTTE. There were people who disappeared and were massacred throughout the 30-year war, and even before that. There are two groups that are not campaigned about much in connection with the international mechanisms. Firstly, the tens of thousands of Sinhala people who were massacred or disappeared during the second JVP uprising, by the state mainly, but also by the JVP. Secondly, the LTTE also massacred several thousands of Tamils, mainly, but also Muslims and Sinhalese, and forcibly disappeared many Tamils. Other Tamil militant movements did the same, albeit on a smaller scale. So even though the state can be seen as ultimately responsible for setting the stage for these crimes, unless all of the violence and wrongdoing is brought to the table, it does not help the national conversation for accountability and justice, and especially reconciliation, because there are accusations and counter accusations all around. That is what you will see when you visit Sri Lanka and talk to different segments of the population. The tragedy here is that the Sri Lankan left has long capitulated to the forces of communalism and neoliberal reform and has lost all credibility and strength. The left terrain has been laid to waste by the 30-year civil war, which shut down all space for political organizing as armed violence obscured democratic resistance. Significantly, it has not been possible to organize a strong progressive solidarity movement in the South in support of the beleaguered minority communities. However, ordinary people across the country have continued to resist on local issues. There are a long list of local struggles that are still going on in small levels. The struggles by several groups of Tamils to win back land confiscated by the military, the campaign to shut down the coal power plant in Sampur, the Indian coal power plant in Sampur, the fishermen of the north who continue to struggle against the blighting of their livelihoods and lives, such as livelihoods by Indian trawlers, the families of the disappeared, mainly Tamils, but also some Sinhalese, environmental campaigns that are linked to people's livelihoods and health and lives, such as farmers' protests around the country, protests for clean drinking water, and the sale of lands for corporate profit, the dispossessing local people and their economies. Keep Puttalam Clean campaign against waste dumping by Britain in Puttalam, and various trade union struggles against slashing of public funding for services, workers' rights, wage rise for plantation sector workers, and many more. I can't list all of them, are continuing. People are resisting daily in their own locations with the people who surround them. But all these people, all these little struggles can be and ought to be brought together. And then an understanding will emerge about what sovereignty really is for the people. Currently, there isn't an overarching progressive democratic leadership that will become an alternative to the majoritarian singular Buddhist nationalist parties that have ruled Sri Lanka so far. The last elections, the current party that came to power went and actively campaigned within the singular majority, saying, "You give us 2/3 majority, you vote for us overwhelmingly, and we want to win this election without having to rely on the minorities." It was a totally racist campaign, and of course they got this resounding majority. The minorities then must find ways to speak to the majority community about how sovereignty is not about being nationalistic and patriotic, but is about economic viability and having a vibrant democracy for the people to exercise in that country, developing a democratic political culture amongst ourselves. Significantly, nationalists of all three communities have one thing in common that I've found when I speak to them. They all want Sri Lanka to become another Singapore. Need I say more what their understanding of democracy is? It is in the interest of the minority communities to reach out to the majority community. It is in their self interest. We can say that it is the singular majoritarian state that has to reach out to us. Yes, that may be right, because the minorities can say we are the aggrieved ones. But it is in our self interest to reach out to the majority community and persuade them that the majoritarian state claiming to uphold singular Buddhist patriotism is irrevocably wedded to global capital and the exploitation of all Sri Lankan peoples. And singular Buddhist majoritarianism is not just is attacking the minorities, but it will also viciously turn against the singular people eventually. So this certainly does not ensure Sri Lanka's sovereignty, which seems to be the Sri Lanka's big beef about the Human Rights Council process. I just finished there.
Thank you very much, Nirmala. That was a lot of complex and diverging and contrasting issues that are at play in Sri Lanka. And trying to get a handle on all of these issues to offer a pathway forward is seems like an insurmountable task, but we've got hopefully about 45 minutes for you two to try and do that. We've had some questions come in from our audience on the Q&A. There are about half a dozen or so. I know Alan has kindly already answered one on the issue of whether or not Canada can refer cases to the ICC. And that was sent in by Roy. Alan has kindly answered that. And now Alan, I think, is following up on that question on whether or not if Canada can refer cases to the ICC if the Canadian citizen was a Sri Lankan Tamil victim. There are 6 other questions that have come in on the Q&A. And I don't know if the audience, if our panelists have had time to read them yet, but I'll read them for you now. Satish asks, what would be an international mechanism with teeth that would get the attention of the government of Sri Lanka and the Rajapaksas? And Savitri asks, Alan, please would you say more about possible measures likely to have positive rather than unintended negative results? And are there issues related to international assistance, especially following the 20th Amendment, which makes it harder to know that funds will get to their planned destination rather than the Rajapaksa cronies? Satish asks again another question, which is, are there divisions and fractures within the Sunnis majority that could start to erode the Rajapaksa's popularity? Quite an interesting question. And Terence asks, how is it that Sri Lankan government, or how is it that, what is he asking? How is it that the Sri Lankan government are able to balance the influence of China and India without provoking each other? Is that a concern for Sri Lanka? We've had a question in from Segu Marazok. Can the Muslims depend on the Muslim countries, including Pakistan, to safeguard their interests? There's a few questions that relate to different spheres of influence and politicking. So I don't know how you would like to divide those up. There's one last question that I'll just talk about, which is from Savitri, a second question, which is, Nirmala, have you any suggestions on how those of us overseas might support the building of stronger links amongst those involved in different struggles for justice in Sri Lanka? Seems to me that perhaps we could go back to Alan on the question of the UN resolutions and whether or not they have there is things in there that have teeth. What perhaps they could, what could they look like, and if they were, if the government of Sri Lanka were somehow tasked and interested in following some of these resolutions, would that indeed have any negative impact for Sri Lankans and sort of unintended consequences? So yeah, I think that would answer perhaps a couple of questions relating to possible measures.
Yeah, well, I thought I could try to answer Satish's question along with Savitri's. I think that one leads into the other, and then I have some thoughts on trying to link it up with some of what Nirmala was saying in her excellent thought-provoking presentation, which I fully agree with. So for Satish, I'd say, yes, there's lots of things that could have teeth, but they're not going to happen probably. And if they did, they would bring them risks. So, I mean, I think, the IMF has potentially a lot of power. They could have certainly it's not hard to see ways in which economic pain could be inflicted on the government by powerful entities. Now, obviously, China, as Nirmala has pointed out, and many before her, the increasing money that China has, the increasing influence they have, active, very active upfront support, often aggressive support for the Sri Lankan government that China is now giving, that has scared India and the US and other Western powers into being a bit softer, I think, for fear of sort of ceding full territory to the Chinese. But that said, I think there's a lot of, if you add up all of the economic leverage that the World Bank, the ADB, the EU through its trade preferences, the US through its, the US is the biggest trading partner, biggest export market for Sri Lanka. And when you put it together with the EU, it's a massive percentage. So you can have lots of ways of really turning the screws on the Sri Lankan government if you wanted to, but it would have a lot of cost to average people, and it would certainly feed directly into a stronger form of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. I think you could also have more aggressive targeted sanctions by powerful governments on visa bans, seizing of assets of the top generals, possibly of some of the Rajapaksa family who have economic interests in the United States. So there's also ways of ratcheting up the pressure. Those I think would have a little less of a downside because it wouldn't be average Sri Lankan suffering, but it would certainly symbolically be framed as Sri Lanka being bullied by the Western powers and so forth, and the war heroes being targeted and treated unfairly and so forth. But in terms of Savitri's question, I was thinking the simple answer is there's not a lot of measures that don't bring with them risks, unfortunately. What I think your thought about the 20th Amendment and the increasing risk of outside, of development assistance and loans and so forth being stolen or being misused because they're, what limited oversight mechanisms had been there in place before have now been thrown out the window, basically. I think that is a good angle to go. And that would be one thing I would be lobbying the World Bank and the ADB and the IMF in their different ways to make sure that their programs of assistance have strong, accounting and accountability mechanisms within them to, more to force to make it harder for the money to be either stolen or redirected in negative ways, or crucially in terms of the assistance the World Bank and ADB give for, say, development in the North and the East, to make sure that the funds are not being used to grab land or to sort of promote development which is biased in the favor of Sinhalese, or is, sort of steals traditional lands from Tamils or Muslims, or is in other ways used to sort of fan the flames of or support the sort of Sinhala Buddhist discourse and practices on the ground. But I think just maybe close with for now with a more general thought. I think the 2015 to 2018 period, because I think the window for reform was really closed by probably early 2018. But you had about 3 years under the previous government where I think you did have some openings for reforms which would have addressed the needs of all communities. This was true in terms of police investigations into corruption and murders and political crimes of the Rajapaksas and their cronies, which were pursued actually quite considerably by the CID, by the police CID, and made a lot of progress. In some cases actually went to court, but they all basically fizzled out even before the Rajapaksas came back. But I think that was a way of that was an opening for the issue of impunity to be tackled in a way that Sinhalese would have been more comfortable with, and it would have helped delegitimize and in some sense criminalize the Rajapaksas in a way that would have opened up, I think, the space for accountability issues at the end of the war to be taken up more easily. Then, but I think that window has closed, at least for now. But I think, the international community can continue to try to frame accountability and impunity through the particular cases that they focus on and the language that they use in ways that remind Sinhalese that it's not just Tamil victims who matter, it's Sinhalese victims, including the ones from 30 years ago in the JVP uprising. There are ways of doing that, of trying to keep the framing as inclusive as possible. And those aren't always followed. And then just one last thought that kind of follows from that. I think a number of those, and I think this goes with another question that Savitri might have raised, in terms of shared struggles across the communities. I think Nirmal is absolutely right. Those need to become the focus. We need to be thinking about how to support those. Unfortunately, so many of those are about socioeconomic rights, environmental rights, often challenging, corporate power or the power of, foreign corporations, which are often supported by by the very same governments, the Western capitalist governments, which are calling for human rights. But the human rights they're interested in are not, generally speaking, socioeconomic rights. They're not about the land struggles of poor farmers, whether they're Sinhalese or Tamil. So the socioeconomic rights and the civil and political rights to the issue of impunity are both potentially places where all the communities can see their shared interest. But I think the latter, the socioeconomic angle, which is potentially quite powerful, is not as likely to be pushed by the same kind of powerful countries as the civil and political rights have been.
Just quickly following on from that before I bring Nirmala back. Alan, Kalpan asks, are economic sanctions a good thing when, as we've heard, Sri Lanka is in serious economic crisis? And I know you've spoken about some of this in your presentation, so has Nirmala too, but given that, as we've just heard, the shared issues, the struggles that many people are facing is against these corporates who rely on a deregulated and privatized Sri Lanka that the government is following through its neoliberal policies. Is it then contradictory for actually the international community to sanction it when actually the international community wants deregulation?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's it's at a general level in terms of you thinking about justice. Yes, it's a contradiction. At a more specific level, I think there would be a claim that, there would be the liberal, neoliberal argument that, that deregulation is about freedom and about giving people their rights to, be active members, entrepreneurs and active in the market. And, so I don't buy that argument, but that would, I think they wouldn't see that contradiction as a contradiction. But yeah, it's but the problem goes back to Nirmala's earlier point. There's not much of a left in Sri Lanka left, right? There's very few. There are some grassroots struggles. There's some small groups, some of them, with some of the friends that Nirmala and I both have in Sri Lanka, doing good work, but they're not very politically powerful. And it's very hard to sort of see it quickly, becoming powerful. And there's not even a capitalist opposition. The UNP has collapsed, and its sort of follow up, its follow-on party, the SJB, is very weak. Hasn't articulated any clear kind of alternative framing on any of these issues. So that's something we haven't mentioned. It's just that there's not much of a classic political opposition really to lead any of these struggles, even in sort of a moderate liberal form.
Thank you, Alan. We have had a few questions that talk about how the government won so easily their campaign based on their racist rhetoric, and what does that mean for the left in Sri Lanka? A few people have talked about this question. Nirmala, did you want to come in and talk about the resistance?
I mean, I'm reading all these questions and I've got bits and pieces to say about a lot of them. So should I go through it, or are you going to read the questions? Because I noticed that, the audience can't read these questions, can they? Oh God, my screen is not moving. Okay, just hold on. The first comment I saw was, I first want to deal with Kalpana's question, which is meant for Alan, but I think about sanctions. I think economic sanctions against the country are completely out. I would myself campaign against it. I don't think any of the Western countries will be foolish enough to suggest something like that. Yes, you target the Rajapaksas. That's fine by many of us, but not the country as a whole. The second thing is, I want to go to Charit's question, and what class struggle is what I'm asking. Yes, people are fighting for land, dispossession, their livelihoods, their rights against the plantation sector bosses, etc. But there isn't an overarching left leadership in Sri Lanka at the moment. One, you talk about import substitution methods that this government, that the central bank governor said, oh, it's going to be all fine. We are going to avert the crisis because we are going to bring about import substitution. We had import substitution till 1977. That's what we had. And then JR came and introduced deregulation and opening up the economy. And since then, we have not been able to look back, partly because we are a small economy. And once we are plugged into this whole neoliberal system and the financial markets, it is not possible to, I think, extricate ourselves that easily. And this party, SLPP, campaigned saying that they would introduce import substitution. But as soon as they came to power, they are running hither and thither and everywhere, seeking loans and currency swap money and more economic deals that actually do not benefit Sri Lanka, with China, India, with the IMF, with the ADB. They said that they were scrapping something with Japan, which the UNP government had proposed, had agreed that deal. But now they said they were scrapping it. Abruptly, they scrapped it. And then now we read today in the press that it's back on again. I don't think they know what they are doing. So let's not take the central bank governor's statements very seriously. I'm sorry. I don't know, the chat thing is... Okay, sorry, Keval. If you remind me what you asked me, because my chat thing is gone frozen.
Yep, no problem. I think there was an interesting question from Sumati, which I'll read out and see if either of you want to take this on. The last government lost or the present government won resoundingly, not only because of its racist campaigns, but because they had not really lost power within the military. The previous government was divided. The support of the West of the UNP government did not help too much. Rajapaksas fashioned themselves as the party of the people. It was also about law and order. The current president said he would bring order into the country of the running of the country. This seems to be a question about to what extent does propaganda in the country facilitate a divided left?
No, I mean, I kind of agree a little bit, and I don't, because one is that it was publicly known that the Rajapaksas went and said, "You give us 2/3 majority, and we will deal with these minorities, or we don't want to rely on the minorities when we are in government." That slogan was spread everywhere. That's one thing. Why was that spread everywhere? Because there is already a built-in consensus amongst the Sinhala people. I'm not blaming the Sinhala people here, but it's been done over decades. And after the war ended, the previous Rajapaksa government really went to town on the war victory, and then showed the international accountability process as an external threat to this patriotic force. The military and the Rajapaksas, they are the real patriots. They won the war, and they won against these LTT terrorists. Yes, they won the war against LTT. Yes, who are fascist murderers. But yes, but they posed this as an external threat, and they really galvanized and sort of bound that consensus really thick and deep, and then they went and appealed to it during the last election. And the UNP was associated with this process because the UNP decided to do something about the corruption and the egregious human rights violations of the previous Rajapaksa government, and take people to court, etc., etc. One, two, it decided to begin moving on the accountability process. It started working on the LLRC. It did this. I think it did the Paranama Commission, and then it did the huge consultation on reconciliation, which interestingly has Sinhala people who disappeared during the JVP second uprising also give evidence in there, I've noticed. So they started doing bits and pieces of work. So the Rajapaksas said, "Look, these guys are traitors. They are betraying us. They are not working in the national interest." So this whole discourse was used to the maximum during the election campaign. It is not simply election propaganda. That is what is being played all the time. So that's one question. Yeah.
Alan, did you want to come in on that before I move on to the next question?
Well, I mean, I think, the UNP government was, of course, divided. The president was not from the UNP, Sirisena, had different background, different party, different approach. And ultimately, those approaches and personalities became very dysfunctionally contradictory and at war with each other, really. But that said, I think this UNP never really had a strategy to deal with anything. And they never had a prosecution strategy. They never had a kind of strategy for selling even a modest sort of revision to the Sinhala Buddhist and majoritarianism that has, as Nirmala has said, has been ensconced in the constitution and the state's practices for decades and decades. And they also were unaware of, they embraced the United States so overtly and with such enthusiasm. I think, if you think of pictures of Mangala Samaravira kind of almost literally embracing Samantha Power and other US State Department officials in ways I think that were, setting themselves up for being branded as the, the traitors of the nation that the Rajapaksas seized on almost from the beginning. So I think there were openings, as Amal Abeyvardhana's question mentions. I think there is space for reconciliation, for intercommunal cooperation on the ground. There still is a little bit, I think. Those initiatives have happened. I think the consultation task force is a brilliant example. But, you had outpouring of, Sinhala villagers, Sinhala activists, Muslims, Tamils all across the country, really taking it seriously, talking to each other. And what happened? The president refused to even receive the report. Ultimately, they had to sort of drag in Chandrika Kumaratunga, the former president, to receive the report. And so, there was that kind of contradiction, but there was space that was not used. And I think, unfortunately, I think it'll be really hard to win back, create again another opening like that for a while. And let me just, because I know Amal and I have a kind of a back and forth publicly on some of these issues in other forums, particularly Twitter. I just want to say, I agree that there needs to be more emphasis on LTTE, accountability for LTTE crimes. And I agree that would be a weakness of my last little briefing. There's just only so much you can pack into 4 pages. But I agree there needs to be more, and that would be one thing that universal jurisdiction cases have already shown. There's already, the only people who've been prosecuted for war-related crimes in Sri Lanka have been Tamils. In France, in Germany, in Britain, in Australia, in the US, and in Canada. All have had trials of some sort for ex-LTTE or suspected LTTE or LTTE members. No, it's not a single Sri Lankan government official or military official has ever been prosecuted in any country outside of Sri Lanka, and in Sri Lanka only in a handful of cases. So I agree there needs to be more emphasis, but I think already in terms of actual legal cases, the imbalance has been in the opposite direction.
Okay, well, just to start at the top of the list now to try and go down and answer them. So this asks, are there divisions and fractures within the Sinhalese majority that could start to erode the Rajapaksa's popularity? Is that a quick question that you could answer?
I think the economic crisis and the economic crisis and falling standards of living, etc., will bring about huge levels of deprivation and privations on the whole country. But the Sinhala people will really, they're already suffering. There's a lot of financial, economic difficulty that is felt by the population. And I think that people could begin to start resisting the government. People could start complaining. For instance, recently I was told, I didn't see it, that there was a woman who had just returned from the Middle East. The Sri Lanka behaved really horrifically towards the domestic workers who are stranded in the Middle East. They wouldn't bring them back, and they were going around on the streets begging for food, and some have died there. This after the pandemic started because of COVID situations. And so one woman had come back and said, I voted for the Rajapaksas. I'll never vote for them ever again in my life because they didn't bring us back, and so on and so forth. And there are lots of people there. But what is problematic is that there isn't a really serious left group that or a broadly progressive alliance that is emerging and has emerged to kind of give voice to these unhappiness with the government. Definitely there is a lot of unhappiness with the government. The UNP is not going to be able to, the UNP or the SJB, they are not going to be able to do this. They are right-wing parties, and they have a racist past as well. There's no question about it, towards Tamils, towards Muslims. And it has to be a left organization that is able to bring minorities and the Sinhala people together. And the conversation about minority, marginalization has to be central to this left force's political agenda. It has to be central. It has to be part of the whole thing. And of course, the class issue, and of course, the issue of neoliberal, exploitation of Sri Lanka as a country. All of these have to be brought together on one platform. But I can't see a broad left and also in the interests of democracy emerging at the moment. And now that this government has come about, the space is going to be completely shut down for anybody to talk with anyone. Can we organize a little people's discussion, a little people's tribunal, or some kind of reconciliation process between Tamils and Muslims in the East. I don't think it's going to be easy unless people are going to face arrests, etc., etc. I'm talking about ordinary progressive Muslim and Tamil activists sitting together, organizing discussions, meetings in the East to talk about what went on in their history. What are the commonalities? What brings us together? And I don't think that is going to be possible under this government. This is because it's just the layers and layers of militarization. It's really scary.
I think I've actually been,
Go ahead,
I
Alan.
mean, I've been surprised by how much popular criticism and agitation there has been towards the Rajapaksas and towards Gotabaya the last year and a half. The question, I think, is will that window close after the Human Rights Council? Because there is the possibility that, that they're being a little bit more gentle. For instance, allowing the P2, they tried to block the P2P march from Potuville to Pulikandi. But they could have done worse. I mean, they could have really stopped it if they'd really wanted to, but they let it happen. But they might not let it happen in a few months or let similar things happen. So I think that's one thing that's open that we still have to see is how strong they're going to be in their reaction and their suppression of dissent. I agree that the economy is absolutely key in multiple ways. My worry that we haven't really talked about so much is how Muslims in particular could be used as scapegoats when the economic, when things really start getting bad. If the debt crisis, if the debt crisis really kicks in, really hits people even more, either because of IMF structural reforms or because of a debt, maybe they actually, have a sovereign default, which has never happened before. So at that point, I think the real risk is the Muslims become the scapegoat or become just the target. Something is, some kind of clash is produced and, they're used as a distraction from the economic pain, the threat of the Muslims. And, even some staged incident is not out of the question. So I think that's something to be really alert to. I guess maybe my perspective is slightly different from Nirmala. I'm not so much although I'm sympathetic, I'm not a kind of a longstanding left activist, at least not with my Sri Lanka hat. I'm a kind of a conflict resolution person. And I think I'm more interested in short-term containment, just how can we keep space open over the next few years, not for a huge left movement to emerge, which it's not going to in a few years, but just to kind of keep the space open so that when the Rajapaksas inevitably become less popular, either because of economic mismanagement or corruption or destroying wetlands or doing all the bad things they're already doing quite openly, begin to really affect their popularity, will there be the space for the next election to actually have an outcome other than the Rajapaksas' victory? And can enough space be kept open for our activist friends and for journalists to continue to report at least a little bit, to have meetings? How do you keep that kind of minimal conditions for a change of regime later on? How do you keep that alive? That's what I'm really interested in. I don't have any quick and easy answers, but I do think the international community could play some role in that process if they were smart.
We have a couple of questions.
Can I just say something about about what Alan just said? Is that yes, I am also in. I mean, the thing is, how do we keep electing these governments? I mean, the thing is, because there isn't another progressive force. There is no guarantee that we will not elect the same government. There is no guarantee that there will be an election in the next term. This is what our worry is. That is also a serious worry. And I must also add that the UNP on the economic front, the UNP was also doing the same things that the Rajapaksas are doing. It's at the same level, if not worse. So that's why I feel that there should be a left alternative force emerging. Otherwise, Sri Lanka is finished.
No, I fully agree. Yeah.
Can I just take on to because I'm talking about the left here a lot. Amrit Wilson's two questions. One is that can I do that, Keval?
Of course, yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah, one is that the current government's plan to the current government is under huge pressure by the Sinhala Buddhist establishment, if you want to say, to scrap, to get rid of the 13th Amendment. And the Tamil nationalist parties are relying on India. India is their guarantor on this, and because the 13th Amendment came as a result of the non-Sri Lankans here as part of the Indo-Lanka Accord, and of course that would be really horrible to imagine, because India will then flex its muscle, and that's not good. We don't want any more of India's intervention into Sri Lanka. Why can't we should try and resolve as much as possible within the country, and the international community can meet with the Sinhala Buddhist lobbies and talk to them. Look, why are you doing this? This is crazy. And it's not just but also, if you get rid of the 13th, I'm not saying the 13th Amendment is the panacea for the minorities' problems. It's not. It's a small measure of devolution to the provinces, which means that the minority regions can have. It really needs to be beefed up a little bit more for them to have some meaningful devolution. And that is essential in a democracy that is a majoritarian democracy, where the minorities are small. We constitute only 25% of the population together. There is this. We need some form of devolution to eventually reach a level playing field, and maybe 100 years from now we may not need devolution. We may not, but devolution also means it's more democracy at the lower tiers. It reduces centralized power, and that is something that we should continue to campaign for, in my opinion. One. Two, Amrit also asked about the left, and the only fully well organized left party, or claims to be left, is the JVP. The mainstream left is now completely disintegrated, or many of the leaders have gone and joined this SLPP or SLFP, they have disappeared down the rabbit hole of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. And which is very interesting, I must say that when the citizenship laws were enacted in India, so many thousands of people came onto the streets to demonstrate, and of course the left was very, very much at the forefront campaigning against the BJP and the citizenship laws, and the BJP's attempt to get rid of the secular constitution of India. Even with all this Hindu nationalism there, it's finding it difficult. But in 1972, we gave Buddhism the foremost place, despite the Sinhalese being an overwhelming majority in the country. The majoritarian mindset is such that even though they are a majority, we have to have more and more powers. And it's enshrined in the Constitution. And the left parties at that time argued for it and supported it whole scale. That is the sorry record of the left parties as far as the minorities are concerned. Forget about their various betrayals of the working classes in Sri Lanka. And because they did that, they have lost all credibility and their numbers have dwindled. Now they have become small parties. And there was a move to abolish the executive presidency. If that movement had taken, and the JVP was involved in it as well, I think, and if that had happened and it had taken, and if they had persuaded Maithripala Sirisena to do something, things would have been different, and the Rajapaksas can't do what they are doing. But of course that didn't happen. So every progressive movement has kind of got scuppered, and the JVP is now kind of mainly talking about corruption. And in Sri Lanka, the levels of corruption came big time after we opened up the economy. That is the case with every post-colonial country. When these neoliberal forces come into your country, the corporates from the West, that's when corruption begins, because we know how Britain and the US are corrupt. Kickbacks and commissions, and you take this deal, and so on and so forth. I mean, I recently read an article by 2 Harvard economists who are critiquing the West for their for ranting against China for taking over the Hambantota airport, because it is again a very corrupt problem, because they have the monopoly of all the construction business in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and that is eroding now because of China emerging. Anyway, so having said that, the JV has become a kind of, it's I don't know, it's not what we hear is that it is not supporting devolution, and that is, then I will seriously consider they consider their left credentials, and I don't see them having such a strong uh, you know far more numerous than any other left group in Sri Lanka. They are not taking the fight to the heartland of the Sinhala Buddhist establishment, because they are being opportunists there, and they will become, if you're only talking about corruption all the time, then you will become like the Aam Aadmi Party in India and kind of disappear into, I don't know, after some time. Just as I mean, I'm being very negative here. I'm being very negative. There are lots of people on the ground fighting their own battles, and it's about coalescing all these groups. And we don't have the democratic space because the military is breathing down our neck. So that's the other problem.
I think on the JVP, my quick thoughts are, their economic program remains rather mired in the past. I mean, the rhetoric remains very old school Marxist. Well, I guess it's more Maoist, but it doesn't really seem to be very alert to current developments in capitalist economics, and it's just not very interesting or engaging. And I think also maybe their refusal to ever really address their own violent past and the brutality of their own previous uprisings certainly limits their credibility among a certain slice of the electorate who might otherwise be open to some of their ideas.
That's true. I mean, when you mentioned the JVP amongst Sinhala people, I've had, oh God, no, not them. I've had that kind of reaction.
We have a couple of questions at the top, which I think we've kind of answered, but it'd be good to get a one line closing statement on it, which is, how is the Sri Lankan government balancing the influence of China and India? And then we've got two other questions that take us internationally, which we can spend a little bit of time doing, which is trying to understand what things can be pushed internationally as either acts of solidarity outside of UN spaces that would try and advance peace and justice in Sri Lanka.
Oh God, I can't identify this question.
Yeah, well, I think in principle that's what we need. We need sort of a kind of a new idea of international solidarity that goes beyond and below governments, because what I find is somebody whose job it is to sort of lobby internationally on Sri Lankan issues. I have to work through either directly through governments, right? I go and meet the US, I meet the British, I meet the Indians, I meet whoever, or I go through multilateral institutions, which are composed of states. So inevitably, whatever more or less genuine concerns I might have for peace and human rights, they get translated through and sort of morph through the states that I have to work with. And this, everybody, this is true of all activism at the international level. So what we need to avoid that is some kind of more true global, lower level, grassroots popular movements. But of course, globally, those are very weak. I think they need to be strengthened. And I think they're, in principle, especially issues of class.
Why are they weak?
Why are they weak? Well, I mean, they're weak. That's one of the biggest questions possible. They're weak for, I don't have a simple answer, except that, they've been weak for a long time. Hegemony of neoliberal ideas, the power of nationalism globally. I think, everybody's sort of all nations are increasingly thinking, the discourse is about protecting their own people and, being hostile towards foreigners, migrants, the other, others within their societies. So, but yeah, it's just thinking about, why they are so weak and what can be done to strengthen them. And then I think that would be very useful, but I think it's a long-term project. But in principle, you could find ways of sort of rights, discourse that actually resonated within Sri Lanka in ways that didn't simply get framed as the rights of one group over the other, but were actually the rights of all. And and I think class and economic and socioeconomic and environmental rights would be a set of issues that are of interest to and of need, of all communities, and could potentially resonate in very productive political ways. But building that global movement it's going to take a lot of work.
Keval,
Yeah.
there are two questions here that talk about the Tamil community.
Mhm.
One is from Roy Vignaraja, and then the other one is from Tanuja, and also there's one from Dushi Pillai. Can I just combine and give my thoughts on those? On
Please
those.
do.
Yeah. Basically, yes, to Dushi. Yes, I think this time the Hindu reporter interviewed local Tamils in Jaffna, and they said, and these are, I think, families of the disappeared, or yes, I think people who had suffered during the war and lost families, etc., family members, and they had said, we are not waiting to see what's happening in Geneva. I know there's a lot of noise about it here, but our lives are not going to be. We cannot wait. We need to move on. We don't expect anything from this government or from the international process. That's how bitter people are, and basically, and this is, some people have told me after. And I have also, after the war, when we go and talk, when I went and talked to people, yes, people. There are people who have survived the war, and they have children to raise, and they have teenagers to educate, etc., etc. So the human spirit, despite you can see the depression on their faces, but despite that, they want to move on, because they want, tomorrow is coming, and there has to be a plate of food on the table for their children. So economic issues are hugely important in the north and east. It, the north and east have become two of the poorest districts in Sri Lanka after the war. They weren't the poorest districts, but they have, and so that is something crucial. The second thing is about Roy Vignaraja's question. Is I want to be very provocative in my answer. What kind of solution is viable for Tamils? Unitary state, United States, federal or confederal or separate state, to maintain non-recurrence of the atrocities and to guarantee the stability in the region. Well, we want we know that Tamils will continue to live in that island, and they can only live in that island depending on what kind of agreement, contract, political contract they can get out of the Muslims and the Sinhalese, the other two communities. One, a majority community, which tends to form government. So the Tamils have to understand. I really am, uh, after several decades of talking about this problem, I am really not interested in labels: unitary, united, federal, confederal, separate state, all of these labels, or nation. All of these are actually transient concepts, in my opinion. It's about how can you live together with the people there. And if we can, we must find every method, every possible trick in the trade to weaken Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism, which is a force that is destroying the whole of Sri Lanka, and it is not allowing the Tamils and the Muslims to live as full citizens, to realize their full potential in that country. So that should be our goal. Let us not say, and you see, when this struggle started, there were Tamil people from the diaspora, who came armed with constitutions for a separate state in 1983 and 1984, from Singapore, from Canada, from the US. And this is just pie in the sky stuff, and actually very undemocratic, because any solution, any political agreement, so the only, if that happens, can only happen with the agreement of the southern population. I want to be saying these provocative things. The southern population have to be weaned away from this overweening Sinhala Buddhist nationalism that they currently And that is our responsibility as well. That is the Tamil people's responsibility as well as the Sinhala people's responsibility. So let us start talking to all the soft Sinhala. The Buddhist bhikkhus won't be talking to us. The soft Sinhala nationalists who think that history starts with the LTT atrocities and that nothing existed before. So let's begin there. Let's start the conversations. And that is about reconciliation. That is the reconciliation that I am talking about. So basically, and so that is very important. And so that's the answer I have for all of these things. And of course, yes, I mean, I hope that answers your question. All the three questions from Dushi and Tanuja and Roy.
Could I just answer? Could I just respond to She's last question?
Sure.
I mean, I think, one thing to keep our eye out for. I'm not sure ultimately, how effective it will be or what its effects within Sri Lanka will be in terms of the kind of interethnic dynamics that Nirmala was just addressing. But there is, I think, a possibility of, I think the ICC route, the International Criminal Court route, is closed, and I think it's a non-starter. I think a kind of a genocide investigation tribunal is probably also closed. Independent of the issue of whether genocide is the right framework, I think legally speaking, it's not going to happen. What could happen is finding a friendly state who, like Gambia did on genocide with the Rohingya, could do for Sri Lanka on a separate issue, not genocide, but perhaps torture, perhaps some other international crime, disappearances, something that is, criminalized and on which there's lots of evidence that that crimes have been committed in Sri Lanka. A state could take Sri Lanka to the International Court of Justice on one of those issues. I think that is one possible route where a demand for accountability and justice could be pursued on Sri Lanka at the international level, in addition to specific universal jurisdiction cases, like, for instance, the Syrian torturer who was just convicted in Germany. You could have cases like that as well. Those, I think, are the two options at the international level. So I just wanted to respond quickly to that. I would endorse what Nirmala was saying, but I think the problem is in terms of the need to engage the South, but that is hard work, and there was a real deep debate, I think, in 2015, 16, 17, 18 between Tamil activists and Sinhala activists. It wasn't just on ethnic lines, but it was largely on ethnic lines about how to try to about that issue, about how to the argument of many Tamils was that the Sinhalese activists weren't doing enough work among Sinhalese to bring Tamil concerns to the broader Sinhala population. I don't think very many people were, and I think this was whether Tamil or Sinhala or Muslim or anybody. I think that was partly because a lot of the activism moved to the international level. A lot of people were going to Geneva, they were going to New York, they were going to Western capitals, they were lobbying at the international level in support of the UN resolution and the transitional justice initiatives that were kind of an offshoot or the result of that resolution 30/1. But there wasn't a lot of activism oriented towards the Sinhalese by anybody. And I think that was a problem. But doing that work is very hard. But I think it needs to happen. But then I think every community naturally has a sort of a sense, easily falls into the sense that they are the victims, they are the primary victims. So the crimes of the LTTE, I think, make it very easy for a lot of Sinhalese to see themselves as the victims. But similarly, I think a lot of Tamils, quite understandably, see themselves as the greatest victim, and certainly in terms of numbers killed in the war, that would be true, particularly at the end of the war. And there's a great reluctance to kind of take the first step. I think each community sort of, this is a gross generalization, but a lot of people in each community are sort of looking for the other side to come step forward and kind of apologize or recognize their own responsibility first. And so how do you get beyond that, get out of that cycle, I think, is a real challenge, sort of in terms of like political psychology. I think it's a real challenge.
I have had people tell me that they speak to, Sinhala people tell me, well, during the second JVP uprising, the numbers are debated. Some people say 25,000, some people say 60,000 were massacred, and quite a number of them were enforced disappearances. There were bodies floating down the rivers of Sri Lanka at that time. So basically, they said, we never went out. We never went to complain to any international body. We stomached it and we fought and we continued on. I mean, whereas you are just betraying the country, the Tamils, taking it everywhere and complaining about it. So on and so forth. And remember that the JVP uprising, one of the planks of the uprising was that the political platform at the time was to against the Indo-Lanka Accord, the repeal of the Indo-Lanka Accord, that is devolution to the Tamils. So it was there was a racist thing to it. But of course, and so on and so forth. So basically, it gets very complicated. And so basically, large numbers were massacred, and they say, we never did. Why are you making such a big fuss? Are you the only ones who have suffered? This kind of exceptionalism that each community, and of course the Tamils do as well, demand, is that we have to make efforts for the living, for move on, so that we can remember our past and history. I mean, it is based, the way we move on for the future is, of course, not forgetting our history and remembering the past and bringing that knowledge and arming ourselves with that knowledge to move for the future. But we must move for the future. That, of course, has to happen. And this, all three communities have to do. And of course, the Sinhala progressive community has a big role here to play. We cannot all disappear into little cubby holes of our own, into little organizations. Of course, I am also like that. I am in a little organization. but we have to start these conversations with, I have had difficulty talking to people on the other side of the political spectrum. Yes, I think it's wrong. I must now begin. I have already begun talking to extreme Tiger supporters who I have not supported the Tigers, or soft Sinhala nationalists. I have not spoken to very hardcore Buddhist monks yet, but we have to start doing that, and we have to start doing that as organizations. Reconciliation can only happen with this kind of process. It cannot be ordered from the UN. Is my thing. Right. Anyway.
And then do you, similarly then, both of you, do you feel that constructive conversations for reconciliation have been hampered by actually capitalist interests within the country who want to dominate political agendas for their own access to resources and the country's resources to maintain power, and hiding behind the atrocities?
I wouldn't say that external, corporate forces are doing that. Except I find, Indian businessmen coming in deeply suspect. There are various Indian Hindu organizations that have been coming into the country. We see the color of Hindu worship and practice almost change in the north and east, which is a bit worrying. We can see it. It's every visit I go, I see different kinds of Hindu worship being introduced. That's one thing. But as far as capitalist organizations are concerned, the Sinhala Buddhist establishment has a big business people in there. Some of our friends here at the meeting will know all the people who are supporting the Rajapaksas, who are backing them, maybe financially or politically, or who have been given various gifts, profitable contracts, etc. Yeah, they have an interest in seeing the Rajapaksas remain in power, because they are running this power, they are running this state to benefit a new class of a new capitalist class within Sri Lanka. I remember even before the pogroms against the Muslims started, one of the first things that they did was Muslim businessmen in Colombo were big on the import-export trade, importing goods for consumption in Sri Lanka. They had a big stake in it. A small handful of Muslim traders, not the whole Muslim community. I mean, um, some Muslim traders were very powerful. And in the first Rajapaksa government, that is one of the first things that they did. They attacked this because they wanted those contracts to go to the singular business class, singular traders. And I remember Muslim businessmen, Muslim people coming and discussing this with us and this is what is happening, So it was like under the table whispers, but it was huge, huge, large whispers, very that was the first thing that they did. It's very systematic. It is. Then they attacked the mosques, and then they started the pogroms and started attacking smaller shops. So I've just had noticed that a report on the Digana attack that happened a year before the election, I think.
March 2018.
Right, March 2018, and it's just out apparently, and there's a meeting about the launch of the report. So things like this. So basically, that's. I mean, there is a new capitalist class in Sri Lanka which benefits from communalism. Yeah.
Alan, would you like to comment on the hindrances to reconciliation and the ramping up of communalism as a proxy for capitalism?
Yeah, I'm not quite. I mean, I think your question is such a big one, but yeah, I mean, I would agree in terms of what Nirmala just said. I mean, and it's underreported as someone who's been researching kind of anti-Muslim violence and anti-Muslim campaigning for a long time now. It's very hard to get real facts to back up what Nirmala was saying, but I completely believe it. And even before the active sort of the anti-Muslim campaign took a violent turn, there was this group called Api Singhala, which was a set of businesses who were, sort of a business, a group of business people, business interests who were actively trying to sort of, call for business to go to Sinhalese and not to Muslims and Tamils. And then I think it ultimately did take a violent turn through a series of attacks on these big Muslim-owned clothing chains. So definitely, anti-Muslim, and before that, I think there's a long history of anti-Tamil, targeting of Tamil businesses by Sinhala groups in the name of Sinhala nationalism or using Sinhala nationalist ideas. So I think there's a long history of that. Yeah. And in general, I think, more generally, the world over, nationalism helps undermine class solidarity. I mean, it has for decades and decades, lots of places. And how to challenge that is, is hard, but necessary. I'm not sure that adequately answers your question, but.
That's fine. That's fine. We're in the last 5 or so minutes of the meeting. So before I wrap up, I'd just like to give our speakers an opportunity to kind of perhaps summarize a few of the things that they really want to reiterate and want our audience to take away from today's crucial meeting, and give us some hope for the next 12 to 24 months. And perhaps if we were to organize an event in 6 months' time or a year's time, what could be the title of that meeting? What could it look like? Whoever wants to go first is fine.
Nirmala, do you want to go first? Give me some time to think.
Oh God. I'm kind of, because I've focused on what's happening inside the country. I'm sorry, I've painted a very bleak picture. Well, things look bleak because this government, it's an all-time high as far as repression, etc., is concerned. I mean, even UNP supporters, I think, are UNP supporters are being targeted and are scared to speak up, etc. So, but for me, I think nationalism has, just because the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism is thriving, Tamils and Muslims do not have to breed our own nationalisms and only cast our imagination, political imagination for the future in solely nationalist terms. Yes, we have to fight for minority rights. Yes, we do not have to put up with any kind of oppression on the basis of our ethnicity. But I think it is a very problematic strategy, and because it simply reinforces the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. That is what has done. Now, what has happened is this whole nationalist agenda of the Tamils has moved to the diaspora, which is, and of course, the Sinhala Buddhist nationalist establishment can point to the diaspora and point to the international community's efforts, everything, lump it all together and talk about an external threat and dig their heels in deep and refuse to budge. It's counterproductive in the final analysis. But the Sri Lankan government, Sri Lanka has a majoritarian state, Sinhala Buddhist nationalist majoritarian state. And my message to Sinhala people is to that they have to seriously reflect on this and think about it very seriously. And listen to the minorities with some seriousness, and don't say it's your LTT that committed all the atrocities. That's what started everything. I think that has to stop now. That's all I can say at this moment.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd make 2 points. One, I think, all efforts, and this is, I think, consistent with what Nirmala was just saying, all efforts from outside, as well as from inside, but need to be framed as much as possible in inclusive ways, so that whatever international expressions of concern about rights, about democracy, they need to be framed in ways that increase the chances that Sinhalese could hear their own interests and their own futures represented in those. Now, that's about how statements are crafted. It's about which issues are focused on. It doesn't mean neglect of the need for accountability. It doesn't mean neglect for, the fate of Tamils in the north under, militarization and increasing Buddhist and Sinhalization and so forth. It doesn't mean neglecting Muslim issues at all, but it means framing them in ways that they're part of a larger, a critique of and an expression of concern about larger authoritarian and anti-democratic and kind of abusive forms of power, which I think historically all communities have suffered from. All communities will continue to suffer from them at one point or another, if those dynamics are not changed. And I think in principle, international institutions and even foreign governments, even amidst all of their own particular geopolitical interests and economic interests, can sometimes play a useful role in highlighting certain issues and framing them in inclusive ways. I'd say the second point is just, in a year from now, I think we will probably have a clearer sense about where the economy is going in Sri Lanka. You might have either had the debt crisis explode, or you might have had it contained, but by going to the IMF. Most people say it's like the next 16 to 12, maybe 18 months maximum that the debt issue will have to be managed. So I think how that plays out will have a big impact on almost everything else. It will determine what space and how that space it can be used by various opposition political forces, and how social tensions will, what state social tensions will be. So I think that, we just have to wait and see, and it's very hard. I think there's just one last point, which I think is part of that. I think there's a fantasy among certain Tamil activists that the way to get their sort of Tamil homeland or their Tamil sort of autonomy is through the collapse of the Sri Lankan economy and some massive crisis that will sort of so paralyze the government, bankrupt it, that it will no longer be able to maintain the kind of, jackboot of militarization and control that it has now. I've heard that argument made by very smart people. And I think I don't think economic collapse in Sri Lanka is what is actually going to liberate the Tamil people or anybody. But I do think there will be pressure from some groups to increase economic pressure in a punitive way. And I think that is risky. I think whatever economic pressure might be useful has to be very carefully calibrated in ways that don't produce the kind of economic, huge economic problems that some would like to see. I'll just end it there.
That's great. Fantastic. Thank you so much for both of your contributions. It's definitely moved on the debate, I hope. Thank you very much, everyone who's attended. We had at one point over 40 people attend, and that's on Zoom. And I'm sure we had more than double that on Facebook. We've answered more than half of the questions that were put to us on Zoom. If there were questions that we haven't answered, please continue the discussion on the Facebook thread where this video is live, facebook.com/South Asia Solidarity. You can find South Asia Solidarity Group on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. A copy of this video will be posted online in YouTube in the coming days. So please continue the discussion in the meantime on Facebook. We hope to have Alan and Nirmala back again to kind of continue the discussion. Thank you all very much for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all your questions.
Thanks, everyone. It's a beautiful day and you all came. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.